Alright, and we are live. If you're wondering why I'm in the Five Guys uniform, it's because I got work today. But yeah, I was in a Discord call earlier before I started stream, so I didn't have much time to prepare your stuff beforehand. But yeah, let me just get the stream link, posted Discords. Just get the word out there. Okay. Let's go to the Quarantine Collective one. I think that's about enough places for the live. Okay. Let's go to there. Alright. What are we going to be doing this stream? Well, by the title, you probably already know. They're going to be reading interviews. Specifically interviews from one Yegor Letov, Russian punk rocker, syncretist, co-founder of the National Bolshevik Party in Russia, but yeah. And we're gonna be starting primarily let's see. We're gonna be starting with this one from 1987, Punks in Their Circle. This was an interview conducted by Roman Numanov. We have Yegor Letov, and yeah, we're just going to be reading the interview. We're going to be analyzing some of the stuff, and yeah, all right. All right, they're talking about beer. We're going to be looking for the interesting questions. All right, here we go. Here it is, enlightenment. Having sipped some tea, I ask you a tricky question. Yegor says, go ahead. Interviewer says, what is your attitude towards power? Yegor says, very bad. Why? Because everything I do is a fight against totalitarianism in all of its manifestations, and power represents the worst manifestations of statehood. Oh shit, hold on, my mom texted me. Okay. Alright, let's continue. Hello, Serena. Sorry, I didn't notice Sue. Because everything I do is a fight against totalitarianism in all its manifestations, and power represents the worst manifestation of statehood, and therefore totalitarianism, and therefore fascism, to be precise. And I'm a very ardent anti-fascist, and that's why I believe that all of punk, and everything I can do with my songs, is to fight back against totalitarianism. What are you trying to destroy, says Numanov? Any totalitarianism, both in thinking and in relation to some human connections, especially in state relations, of which the whole of civilized Babylon consists of. So let's analyze these two answers for a second. Everything I do is a fight against totalitarianism in all its manifestation, and power represents the worst manifestation of statehood, and therefore totalitarianism, and therefore fascism, to be precise. So Letov basically views all forms of power or as a form of totalitarianism. Basically, if you hold power, you hold a totalitarian viewpoint in terms of Letov. He says, I'm a very ardent anti-fascist, which means that his goal is to basically fight against all the manifestations that we have of power and of fascism, of totalitarianism. He says that power represents the worst manifestation of statehood, therefore totalitarianism, therefore fascism, to be precise. What he basically means is that whenever you have power, or that power is inevitably going to manifest itself into the worst aspects of your totalitarianism, of your fascism. And there's going to be a quote later on in the interview. I've only watched a snippet of the interview on YouTube, in which he's going to state that fascism, totalitarianism, and that kind of stuff is inherent to humans, and that we should fight, and that his fight is against that. All right, let's continue. And you perceive punk rock only as a musical means of expression? For Letov says, not only musical, but also textual. Well, Numanov says, or do you also preach anarchism in music, i.e. contrition? I have a slightly different attitude to music. It's somehow inherent in me from the very beginning that a song should be a hit. That is, a song should work many times repeatedly. I proceed from what the Ramones or the Clash or the Pistols do in the West. That is, the first wave of punk. Not the X-Pound, but the early punkers. It has to be a very cool song, simple and very memorable, tough. So it has to be a hit. That is, it has to have a hook that will catch you, and at the same time the song should spin in your head, be remembered, and have an effect many times. I write songs like this. If I remember it, it starts spinning in my head. I play it a day, 2, 5, 20 times, and every time I get a thrill. That means the song is cool. If after 3 days a song just gets boring, I don't sing it anymore. That's why my songs are tough, primitive, and at the same time very melodic. So he's talking about his approach to songwriting here, where he says that a song, in his view, should be very simple, very straightforward, very to the point. And that is what punk is. Something that is straightforward, simple, to the point, and that is also very catchy. That's also very, what's the word for it? Very melodically satisfactory, so to speak. In a song, does the music come first or the lyrics? And somehow at the same time, it turns out that the primary thing isn't even the music, but some kind of rhythmic structure, so to speak. A catchy phrase is needed. Our own shit doesn't stink, or we're in deep shit, around which everything unfolds. The main thing is to catch a certain moment, and then everything falls naturally. Actually, music is... Alright, Physics Gamer says, music needing to be simple, straightforward, to the point, and catchy is something Plato says in The Republic. Interesting. So Plato probably would have been in favor of punk rock if he was alive today. Interesting. Okay. Every song of mine is just one phrase played out in one way or another. That's why all my songs are like, fuck you all, or we're in deep shit. So basically he's talking about how I feel like to kind of tie it into something, it would be like how a lot of people approach rap music, where he talks about like some kind of rhythm. The primary thing isn't even the music, but some kind of rhythmic structure, so to speak. Boom, yeah, that's rap. A catchy phrase is needed. Boom, you got rap music with a catchy hook. Simple, straightforward, to the point. My recollection is that he believed that music needed to be simple and able to avoid chaos and inflaming the passion, so probably wouldn't like what Letov is going for here. Yeah, probably. That would be where Plato and Letov diverge. So Letov is somebody who is a very ardent believer in adhering to chaos, whereas Plato is somebody who would probably believe in more order. So the simplicity for Letov would be a simplicity for what's the word for it? Trying to expound upon that chaos as much as possible, whereas for Plato, it would probably be to expand upon the order as much as possible. All right, now we get an interesting one. Do you believe in democracy? That is it even possible? No, to be honest, I don't believe it. Let's say totalitarianism is crushed, but for what purpose? Oh, I don't believe it. It says Letov, maybe for the sake of democracy. So so this is a big answer from Letov. So that's the question you're asking. How can I tell you? I'm an anarchist in the sense that it is possible among the beatniks or something. You can't destroy power because totalitarianism is ingrained in the human mind. And so the game is lost from the start. Galich has this really cool song about prisoners escaping from prison, getting killed one after the other. It ends with them all, it seems, killed, and he simply ends in a blank verse. All the same, even if not a single one had made it. It would still have been worth running. It was necessary. The game is lost from the start. I know that. Nothing will be done, but nevertheless. There's so a lot of this so I went over this section of the interview with semi-friend of the channel, President Sunday, and basically he took the view that this betrayed a pessimism inherent in Letov's ideology, which I don't take to be a pessimism. I think that it is like some form of optimism where he believes that even if the fight is not worth how do I put it like this? Even if the fight that you participate in is a losing battle, it is still worth it to have fought anyway, because what matters is the fight, not the goals for which the fight is fought for. The means matter far more than the ends to Letov, and so that's what he's trying to portray. That is what he is trying to say with regards to this. To continue, there's a parable by Nikolai Volkov, a dissonant of sorts. There were some people, it's unclear how they ended up in the chest, but they ended up in the chest and lived there year after year. They lived, forgot what was happening behind the chest, planted potatoes, and since the chest was closed, because the evil spirit had locked it, there was no fresh air or light. It was dark, damp, and stuffy, but they got used to it. They thought everything was fine. They grew up weak, rickety, with pale faces. But one day, the shackle of the lock rusted and broke. A stream of fresh air entered the chest, and people inside were stunned, looking at such light and such air. At first, they thought they were suffocating, and the most curious ones climbed to the lid and began to peek. Then the evil spirit began to close the lid again, and people kept resting their elbows and heads on the edge. The lid would pinch these elbows or tear them off completely. Not how that works, Letov. You need to learn your anatomy. The lid, but because someone was constantly resting their head, the lid didn't close. So a stream of fresh air, albeit weak, entered the chest. That's the situation. I think what our rockers and punks do is exactly that. So let's take the parable and what he's trying to illustrate with that. So basically he takes this parable of like people living in a chest where some evil spirit is keeping it closed, but one day the lock of the chest just magically rusts off and some fresh air and sunlight is let into the chest, and people are stunned. They're just amazed at this air and this light, and so they come over to the edge of the chest and they peek through it, and they rest themselves on it just to like get a whiff of the fresh air and the sunlight. But the evil spirit just keeps trying to close it, but he can't close it completely because there's always somebody resting themselves on that chest. And so Letov's view is that this is analogous to what we should be doing in terms of our resistance, because even if there is always going to be somebody wanting to close that chest, it is still worth it to rest ourselves upon that chest, because that gives us, even if it's only a little bit, it gives us that fresh air, it gives us that sunlight that we can experience, and the act of experiencing that fresh air and sunlight is what matters to the people in the chest. And he analogizes that with the current situation, probably to the Soviet Union, considering this is part of an underground magazine written in the Soviet Union about punks and rockers in the Soviet Union, because he sees himself as one of the people resting themselves upon the chest for that fresh air. And he thinks that what matters is not what matters, again, is not the ends to which you get to the thing. It is the means by which you do it. Wait. And so it's a bit like anti-Machiavellian in that sense, because for Machiavelli, the ends justify the means. I have not read The Prince. I have not read the Discourses on Livy, but I'm just mainly going off of like popular perception of Machiavelli. That's how most people perceive him. It's like the ends justify the means, and so Letov would ask the question, but I don't think that the ends justify the means. The ends don't matter. What justifies the ends then? So so basically what he's trying to say here is that even if we're in a losing fight, what matters is that we fight. So then let's continue with the interview. Is it more impossible? No. So what you can do is take a sip of clean water from time to time? Partly so, and secondly, all this is done initially for oneself. I believe that every person is inherently alone. Therefore, everything they do for themselves. Basically, anarchy triumphs if it is internal anarchy. If a person achieves inner freedom, specifically internal anarchy, it is a victory. And every time a song by the band Chife, for example, about a cat is a victory on a global scale, a global victory over the system. And yeah. So let's analyze this for a second. I believe that every person is inherently alone. So what Letov is saying isn't that like, oh, you're forever isolated and there's no point in like making friends with anybody, having social relations and whatnot. That's not what he's saying. I think that he's saying that that at the end of the day, stripped of everything, what every person has is themselves, and they live with themselves. And everything that they do is for themselves. He's kind of a bit of an egoist in that sense, but I don't really consider him to be an egoist. But what he says, if a person achieves inner freedom, specifically internal anarchy, it is a victory. What he basically is saying is that even if we cannot achieve external anarchy in the sense that we cannot crush the system, what matters is the victory that we achieve with ourselves. In the sense that if we find freedom within ourselves, then that is the victory that matters, so to speak. All right, Aksionov had a story about a grandmaster. If you've read it, maybe, having received an affirmative answer, he continues. The grandmaster is riding on a train, playing with some Luber and Urlach. For context, a Luber is basically somebody who is basically a Russian word for a hooligan, a misfit, a thug. The grandmaster checkmates him, but the Luber doesn't notice and continues to play. It's embarrassing to remind this grandmaster that he was checkmated long ago, and he continues playing. Then he got fed up and gave up, and the Luber said the grandmaster, looking sad because he has to play games like every day, opened the suitcase containing medals to the one who conquered me and hung them on the Luber's chest. The same situation happens in real life. So let's analyze this really quickly. We went over this again with President Sunday a few days ago, and Sunday's read on this is that the Luber is basically somebody who is basically a representation of the totalitarian within somebody who refuses to play by the rules just for control over the situation, and the grandmaster is representing the person who plays by the rules, who wants to live their lives as best as possible, and who eventually will give in to that totalitarian urge. He essentially views it pessimistically. But I take a different read on this. I think that the Luber is basically the non-totalitarian aspect of the human mind, which is essentially, how do I word this? It is a refusal to play by the rules of the totalitarian, of the person who wishes to have control, and the grandmaster is the totalitarian because by dint of them having established the rules, by dint of them being let's see. Let me check my Discord pings. Okay, nothing important. But continuing, the Luber is the anti-totalitarian. The grandmaster is the totalitarian. By dint of them establishing the rules, by dint of them having being the rules that you play by, And so eventually, with that fight, the totalitarian will eventually seed the ground, and you move on to the next totalitarian to fight. You move on to the next chess grandmaster to basically play into submission, so to speak. All right. In short, there can be no democracy. Letov says, not on a global scale. Totalitarianism is ingrained in the human mind, and it's impossible to convince an asshole that they're an asshole. There's a Buddhist proverb: you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So everyone swallows for themselves. Since humanity has existed for 4,000 years, this proves that fascism remains as it was, and as long as there were Christs, so they remain. So this is so let's pick apart what Letov is saying. Totalitarianism is ingrained in the human mind, and it is impossible to convince an asshole that they're an asshole. Basically, what he's saying is that in the moment, and not that there's people that you can. Not that there is people who can't absolutely not be redeemed in whatsoever, but that in the moment, the people who are adherents to their desire for control over other people, over their own lives, cannot. It is difficult to convince. It is damn near impossible to convince them that they should desire their freedom over their desire for control, and so that's essentially what I'm taking Letov to be saying. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, so everyone swallows for themselves. Letov is basically saying, okay, let's compare people to the horse, okay? You cannot force a horse to drink water, even if you lead it to a pond, a pond full of nice, pristine, clean water that you can just drink from immediately. There's no dirt or nothing in it. You could just take a nice handful and sip from it. You basically have to make the choice to drink the water, essentially, is what he's saying. Much like you have to make the choice to free yourself in essence from your totalitarianism, to fight against it. And this ties back into what Letov says about it, about there can't be no power, no totalitarianism, because it is an eternal struggle for Letov. So, and since humanity has existed for 4,000 years, this proves that fascism remains as it was. As long as there were Christs, so they remain. And basically reaffirming that eternal struggle narrative of, as long as there are people like Jesus Christ, for instance, who preached compassion, who preached care, who preached empathy, there will always be people who go against that message and who will go after the Christs of the world in order to maintain the control that they have over other people. All right. Now let's go over to this one. Do you believe in love? Tricky question, says Numanov. What a question. What do you mean by love? I'm actually a religious person, to be honest. And God? Says Numanov. Yes, and God is the embodiment of love. God isn't some high-powered guy sitting there ruling over everyone, but God according to Buddhist philosophy. Love isn't about loving someone for something, but loving like breathing, like living. But in the conditions of our lives, things just don't work out that way, and that's basically impossible. This rules out being a rocker, because to me, a rocker is someone who lives among everyone and cares about others in the world. Let's analyze this really quickly. Numanov, yeah, exactly, Numoev, let's see. Am I getting it wrong? Oh, it is Numoev. I was getting it wrong. I thought it was Numanov. Alright, Numoev. Sorry. I was getting it completely wrong. So let's analyze this for a second. Don't butcher the name of the man who wrote Afghansky Syndrome. I won't. Sorry. God is the embodiment of love. God isn't some high-powered guy sitting over there or ruling everyone, but God according to Buddhist philosophy. I'm not entirely sure what Letov is referring to in terms of God in Buddhist philosophy, but in terms of what he's saying here, Letov is basically taking God to be not like an arbiter who not some like arbiter of all morality, all rules and whatnot, but more of like a metaphysical embodiment of a concept. In this case, love. Love isn't about loving someone for something, but loving it like breathing, like living. Essentially, what he takes love to be is basically not like something transactional, where you just look, where you, not some sort of like attachment to a quality of a person, so to speak, but like some sort of natural attraction to somebody, unconditionally, so to speak. And when he says, but in the condition of our lives, things just don't work out that way, and that's basically impossible. He's talking more so about like how humans view love, where they view love as conditional, as transactional, in a certain sense. Like there are qualities inevitably that we will be attracted to in other people. This rules out being a rocker, because to me, a rocker is someone who lives among everyone and cares about the others in the world. So here's where we get into this interesting concept of the rocker. Basically, what he take the rocker to be is basically Letov's ideal. It is his Übermensch. It is basically somebody who has care and who has empathy for who has care for the people around them, and who has empathy for the people around them, and who has care for the world that they live in. And so those are the central tenets of what being a rocker is. And when Letov says that rules out being a rocker, he's not saying that it's like an impossible ideal to achieve, because I think that for Letov, that is basically the goal of being, that is the ultimate goal, so to speak. You can become a rocker if you have empathy and if you have care. But like, how do I put this? It requires a certain, not necessarily overcoming of the human conditioning, but rather like acknowledgement of it and an active resistance towards it, so to speak. All right, Numayev says, yes, but if you profess personal love, then you will have to worry about one person, so you simply don't have time for others. That's why I don't have a woman next to me. Pretty ironic, considering he would like, I think at some point after this interview, start a relationship with Yanka Jagileva, another Russian singer-songwriter. I genuinely can't imagine putting all my love into one person, and if I take a global approach, I love animals more than people and trees even more. I think he was more cynical on that specific issue, as described in Stop the Rolling Stones. I'd probably need to listen to Stop the Rolling Stones. That's communism, right? So let's analyze this. I generally can't imagine putting all my love into one person, and if I take a global approach, I love animals more than people and trees even more. So what Letov is basically saying is that he cannot conceive of a world in which all of the love that he has within him is put into one person. He'd rather take a more universal approach to love, and when he does take that universal approach to love, that love is more extended towards the animals and the trees and basically all the love that he has for those, he prioritizes over the love that he has for people, so to speak. He's kind of like this kind of ties into a few of the more syncretic pagan views that he'd adopt later on, where he basically has this sort of reverence for the natural world, and the eco-anarchism that he would adopt towards the end of his life, so to speak. All right, let's continue. In general, if we touch on rock, then for me the concept of empathy is the most important of all human empathies. The most important of all, that is, a rocker or any person in general who is incapable of empathy when someone else is in trouble, that's not a rocker, and therefore not a human being. So let's analyze this for a second. And he says, for me the concept of empathy is the most important of all human empathies, the most important of all. Well, to me, all right, let's see what Pierre Copium says. To me, it seems more consistent with his general disappointment in humanity rather than an actual attempt to embody some ideal. Potentially, yeah. I mean, I don't take Letov to be this like blanket misanthrope. I think that he has I think that he has like I think it's more so he acknowledges the fact that people can be just as cruel as they can be empathetic and caring. So when he says and he says this, and I think this is supported by this thing. For me, the concept of empathy is the most important of all human empathies. He's generally speaking when he says this, he's basically saying that there is. Hold on just a second. I need to think for a moment. He's essentially saying that the most important thing that we can do is be empathetic. The most important ideal we can embody is the ideal of the empathetic person. Because the empathetic person is somebody who lives with consideration for the world around them and for the people that live in that world. And so when he says that is a rocker or any person in general who is incapable of empathy when someone else is in trouble, that's not a rocker and therefore not a human being. And I think Numoev says Gopnik Luber, or real rock comes from empathy. In the next sentence, he says that there are people, that somebody who has chosen to forgo their empathy and forgo the care that they have for the world, they've essentially lost touch with what makes them human, so to speak. They have lost touch with the consideration that they have for the world around them. They live without care for the world around them, and thus they have in essence, quote unquote, lost their humanity, so to speak. And so Numa says, but people aren't born Gopniks. Letov says, they are born. Do you think so? Yes, they are born. I think Numoev says, I think that in some ways we, rockers, can make it so that, so to speak, the younger generation are not Gopniks. Letov says, teach me from personal experience for nothing more. Oh wait, who's A in this equation? I don't think that this is Numoev. It's Arthur Strukov. Okay, so I've got it completely wrong. All right. Oh, I thought somebody did something, typed in something new. That was my bad. So Strukov basically says, so it was Strukov talking, not Numoev. He says, I think that is to turn them into rockers. Numoev says, no, I believe it is impossible to teach anyone from personal experience. Yes. And Letov, in response, are you familiar with Numoev? Because that puts an interesting spin on this whole thing. I'm not entirely familiar with Numoev. I might have to do some research after the stream's done, or I could do it right now. Let's see. Let's meet Roman Numoev. There's certain to be a Wikipedia page on him, certainly. There's a Genius page. Alright, and I guess we're gonna have to translate that. Okay. The artist bio was unreviewed. Perfect. Roman Numoev is a Russian punk musician, poet, writer, and photographer. He is one of the leaders of the Russian punk band Survival Instructions, or... Oh man, he has a song called Kill the Jew? Oh boy, oh boy. Oh boy. Numoev is what I call a bleeding heart fascist. So he's basically like a... Oh, so he's a fascist then. I see. I don't really know, that Ubi is not as clear cut as it sounds, though I never went into it. So is it like... Yeah, I'd have to look more into Numoev in order to in order to see the context of this interview. But in any case, so Yegor says it's the only way, in response to Numoev saying it is impossible to teach anyone for personal experience. He says, I think it's the only way. I think it's possible. That's Nick Rock and Roll. He's doing harakiri on stage. I just saw him giving a session on St. Petersburg. He's sitting there cutting himself. He's bleeding. In short, real rock. Some rich girls are there, and for them it's a terrible shock. Who knows what will happen to him, in which way they'll turn. But it's a terrible shock, and rock is supposed to shock. It's punk. It's about shock value. Shock value is directed at oneself. So Letov is basically saying that the purpose of rock, the purpose of punk, the purpose of doing anything is to bring attention to the thing. It is to shock. It is to shock. And that shock is a way for Letov to have people confront the ugly parts of themselves, to have them confront the fascism within themselves, the totalitarianism within themselves, just to have them confront the ugly aspects of their humanity, in a way calling attention to it, for Letov, has the purpose of inspiring resistance against it. And now we can argue about whether or not the shock value does in fact effectively call attention to these things and lead to resistance against those things. But for Letov, he was basically but Numoev was also consistently anti-war and had a song in which he claims he'll join minorities in their struggle while also using slurs to refer to them. Interesting. All right. Instrukcja po v. Let's take a quick diversion to look at Živoin. Let's take a quick diversion to look at this. Let's look at this Grub album. God damn it, Google. We're going to Wikipedia. Alright, we're translating this. Alright. Instrukcja po Vision is the 17th studio album by the band Gражданская Obrona, recording the band's survival instructions, released in 2013. Criticism. The album received mixed reviews. Numoev on the album. In the mid-1990s, Letov and Numoev's relationship soured. Numoev cites Letov's jealousy of Yanka Djagileva as the cause of their first conflict in 1988. He would later comment on Letov's cover-up of his songs. I acted here simply as a speaker for the ideas that you, Yegorushka, implanted in my consciousness, softened by the atmosphere of the pleasant journey, but thank God I somehow got rid of these ideas over time. On January 25th, Letov, in response to a question on the official website, it stated that the album would not be reissued and that its existence would best be forgotten. So he's basically saying that, he regrets doing the album. And there's a Russian Wikipedia page on Numoev. Let's take a look at it. His poetic text gained wide popularity and promoted by the group Gражданская Obrona thanks to the album's survival instructions. Public position. An Orthodox believer, he calls himself a Russian nationalist and monarchist. He has consistently criticized Russia's policy towards Ukraine. In 2014, he has actively spoken out against the military escalation against Ukraine and has directly criticized Vladimir Putin, leading him to believe he is under surveillance by security services. And this guy's still alive. Jesus. Alright, because of his performance of a song called Kill a Jew, he is repeatedly associated with anti-Semitic ideas, despite the fact that Numoev himself and people who know him closely give contradictory characterizations of his position. So nobody really knows if he's nobody really knows. From what we can tell him, he is a self-described nationalist. He is let me be clear, Numoev supports the annexation but is against the war, odd fellow. So he's okay. So my read on Numoev is basically he's a nationalist. He is definitely a nationalist. He is maybe an anti-Semite depending on who you ask. He's somebody who is like for the annexation of Ukraine, but also didn't want there to be an entire war about it. Weird guy. All right. I see. Says Numev. Otherwise they won't believe. Okay, Letov says otherwise they won't believe it in regards to like the shock value stuff. Letov says it's not that they won't believe it. They'll believe it if they want to, or they won't if they don't. Everyone has their own quirks. Everyone decides for themselves where to go. It's just that everything a person does puts others in a position of choice, which direction to take, and a certain opportunity to compare themselves with, say, you in standing on stage and singing. For me, rock, I read this in your articles referring to Roman Numev, is something individual, meaning that a person is themselves as long as they can be themselves, practically to the point of self-destruction, constantly bringing yourself to a state of zero, where there's nothing left to lose, like the existentialist or something. You have an empirical existence, that is, your experience, the one you've gained, is present in the purest form. Interesting philosophical thing. So, he's essentially taking people, Letov is, essentially taking people, saying everyone has their own quirks, everyone decides for themselves where to go. He's essentially taking a free will position, if I'm reading this correctly. And that the people who are using shock value to deliver a message is putting people in a position of choice as to whether or not they want to, as to which direction they take. Like, whenever gotta stretch. When Letov says this, he's basically saying everybody has a choice. And it's up to and when they're confronted with something that shocks them, whenever they're confronted with something that shocks them, something that challenges them directly, they have a choice as to whether or not they want to change themselves or remain the same. And so, and he says, rock for me, rock is something individual, meaning that a person is themselves as long as they can be themselves, practically to the point of self-destruction, constantly bringing yourself to a state of zero, where there's nothing left to lose, like the existentialist or something. He's saying basically, again, and this is tying back to the everybody is inherently alone thing, that when you strip somebody down to from everything that they have, what they are left with is themselves. And so what they are left with is, and so this is like tying into the authenticity to like what I think is a core tenet of Letov's ideology, which is authenticity. So, a person is themselves as long as they can be themselves, practically to the point of self-destruction, basically means that we are constantly in a state of trying to figure out what our true essence is, to the point where we will destroy ourselves if we were to, in the journey to find our true selves, basically. And let's take a look at these last few sentences. You have an empirical existence, that is, your experience, the one you've gained, is present in its purest form. So let's take this apart real quickly. You have an empirical existence. So Letov is basically saying that that you are real. You are in this world. You live within this world, and that is real. I want to say that this is a little bit of a Heideggerian position, but I haven't read enough Heidegger to say definitively that this is Heideggerian. But like, he says that your experience, the one you've gained, is present in its purest form. Again, this is reading to me very Heideggerian, because from my understanding of Heidegger, he basically thinks that the thing that separates the thing about humans is that we are constantly being in the world. That is to say, we are existing within the world and we are participating within it. We are not separate from it. We are part of this world. And Letov is basically taking the exact same position, and based off of whatever my read of Heidegger's philosophy is, that it is a fact, it is a given that we are a part of this world. And this ties back into the authenticity part, the constantly bringing yourself to a state of zero part, or where there's nothing left to lose part. Essentially what he's saying is that because we are a part of the world, we basically, that our goal is to basically find out what our part in the world is. And that is our constant struggle, or one of our constant struggles, so to speak. So Strukov says, like the cynics or something? Letov says, yes, I don't even know. I have no idea about the cynics. Numerev says, it's clear that your position is that, in general, you have nothing to do with art. Letov says, what, with art as with aesthetics? Numerev says, with rock, I mean. Letov says, no, I don't. Rock is not art. So, interesting. So, and this goes into part 2 of the interview. Letov says, art is pop, and Strukov says, rock is an impact, and art is also an impact. And Letov responds, well, art as aesthetics, as something artistic. Rock is completely different. Rock is something connected to religious matters. A principle of shamanism, says Numerev. Exactly, punk rock is shamanism in its purest form. This is tying back into the more mystical elements of Letov's philosophy. Yeah. Okay, then rock is an idea, says Strukov, and music is means of realizing this idea. Letov says, yes, rock isn't really music in that sense, in my opinion. And the quintessence of rock is punk rock. And everything else is, says Numerev, is it a means to prove this idea or to implement it? Letov says, so purely sound matters? Of course, says Strukov. It's possible, says Letov, in principle without music. Punk doesn't mean either rock or, and he gets cut off. You can simply turn into an orator, more precisely, an oracle, says Strukov. So Letov says, rock isn't just about talking. You can paint a picture that would still be rock. So when Letov says that rock is an art, he's more or less referring to rock as an essence, since that an essence that is within the people who make the art. That's what he means when he says you can paint a picture that would still be rock. Okay. And when he says punk rock is shamanism in its purest form, he's basically saying that there's an essence, a spirit to rock, a spirit to punk rock that transcends the need for art, for its description as art, for description as an aesthetic, so to speak. In any case, says Strukov, you try to make some chords and convince more firmly with them. Letov says, Mukomoro, for example, doesn't even record anything. They stage street protests like execution. Letov's, what if fly agaric? Let's see. Let's look this up really quickly. Mukomoro. It's not giving me any results. Okay, it's a mushroom. She's talking about mushrooms. Let's see if I type in Russia group. Okay, so I'm not really getting much historical context from this. If Pure Copium does have the context for this... Oh! Let's see what this is. 23 pages. Alright, let's find fly. Okay. So it looks like there's this entire 23-page long paper. The Russian post-Soviet history of fly agaric. Okay, Russian Eurasian iconography, da-da-da-da-da. The Mukhomor was deployed to find years of this. Okay. The Mukhomor, the Russian name for the fly agaric, was employed in the final years of Soviet power as a symbol of redemption by dissident underground movements and is significant present in Russian intellectual. Okay. Let's skim through this. The fly agaric in Siberia. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Mukhomor literally means fly killer. So so apparently the particular mushroom that they're talking about is like a symbol. Well, a symbol for like a symbol used by the underground in Russia. So there might have been a group called the Mukhomori that was primarily using that symbol. Oh, and okay. So Letov says Mukhomoro, for example, doesn't even record anything. They say street protests like execution. What kind of fly agaric? He says. What you were talking about is Mukhomoris. What you're talking about, Mukhomoris is a punk band, a punk conceptualist in Moscow since 1976. Oh, okay. Okay, Mukhomori art grupa. Let's see. Let me go into the stream real quick. See, I can't copy and paste it. Sadly. Okay. I think Letov just gave us the context anyhow. What you were talking about, Mukhomoris is a punk band, a punk conceptualist, Moscow, since 1976. The first act, Execution, the action Excavations, that's them too. Pioneers of punk, basically. They took Sven Gundlach, that's the guy they have, and buried him in the ground for real. They dug a dugout for him, about 1.5 meters underground, and buried him. They gave him a flashlight and a piece of paper so he could write down his impressions, how he felt there underground, and then went out on the road and shouted, "Comrades, we're going to the action Excavations," and they went to dig up Sven. It turned out they had forgot where they were digging and started poking around all over this wasteland, and they barely managed to dig him up in about 3 hours. He was already starting to choke, but he was still alive. They gave him some kind of... Oh. Alright. Translate this shit. Translated Russian into English. Okay. Reloading the page. Translate it again. They gave him some kind of artificial respiration, but he went nuts and screamed and ran out. That's the kind of action they did. Another action is called Execution. People gather on Gorky Street. They shout, "Comrades, we invite you to the action Execution," and lead the crowd into the bushes. There's Sven standing chained to the wall. They, the two Mironenko brothers, and Zvezdashev, take toy guns, pistols, and shoot him. Sven falls, blood comes from out of his mouth. They grab him by the legs drag him down the street covered in blood, his head on the pavement. Those are the kind of guys they are. It's punk rock. Or maybe they, when the metro opened in the morning, got on the first train and decided to hold out as long as possible. They held out till 10 o'clock in the evening. They couldn't hold out any longer because the pressure underground was high. In short, because they were into the surface and such a depression rolled over them. Okay, so he's basically talking about an art group here that stages like subversive. That basically stages like subversive, very like dangerous. And it's like, I don't know if I want to say dangerous, but subversive kind of shocking art exhibitions out in public. Shukov says, no, it's too abstract. Letov says, abstractly, not abstractly, but these are our guys. They created all the punk in our country, recorded their own album. They had nothing to play, they just recited poetry and shouted songs. The Moscow Community Center emerged from the Mukhomora. They are the teachers of the community center and practically all punk in our union. Yes, burying somebody alive is dangerous, absolutely. They are the teachers of the community center, practically all the punk in our union. Well, the Mitki, I think, are a certain manifestation of punk, Russian punk. What about the Mitki? Just gonna think. The Mitki are an art group in St. Petersburg, Russia. The Mitki movement originally is sorted in the Mitki, which contains 8 chapters. Literary work Mitki, da-da-da-da-da. It encompasses a collection of ironic, absurd essays, conversations, da-da-da-da. Although Mitki is fictional, it draws upon the characteristics of Okay. So, looks like the Mitki are... So, looks like he's talking about another absurdist art group. The first collective exhibition of Mitki paintings in 1984 ended peacefully, but on the second in St. Petersburg was raided by police. After Glasnost, the group's work became accepted and was soon shown beyond St. Petersburg. Mitki, written before and after Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika in 1987, expresses the transitions and associated anxieties of the time. Shinkarev and Florensky both left the Mitki group to develop their own new work in the new Russia. Okay, so it's an absurdist group. Okay, now they're talking about albums. Okay. Okay, here's an interesting one. Strukov says, when Kolya listened to Grob, he spat at it, shouted that it was just hairy intellectualism. When I tried to convince him that it was punk anyway, and what was wrong with the former hippie switching to punk, he'd say, well, they switched, and we've been punk for 10 years now, while back then they were going love, 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 and peace. Letov says, I think hippieism and punkism are the same thing. Punk is aggressive hippieism, very aggressive, specifically social hippieism. Numev says, punk is the hippieism of action. Letov says, yes. It's Iggy Pop, MC5. If. That's an interesting little tidbit. So basically Numev basically says punk is the hippieism of action, and Letov says, yes. Essentially what he's saying is that there's a breakaway from hippieism that goes into punkism. And essentially what he's saying with saying hippieism and punkism are the same thing, and punk is aggressive hippieism. He's essentially saying that the punk movement basically is an evolution of the hippie movement, where the hippie movement was generally associated with like peace and love and all that bullshit. The punk movement decided that merely preaching these messages is not enough. We need to do action with regards to those messages. We need to take the core tenets of the hippie movement and turn that into action. And so that is what the punk movement is. Or that is what punkism is to Letov. Alright. I'm more so interested. I'm trying to find more shit on his philosophy. Okay, this one. What is your relationship with Leningrad? Referring to the Leningrad rock scene at the time. That is unusual considering Letov turned into a hippie later on. Did you check the Grob official site? I've not checked the Grob official site. I'm looking at these interviews from a site called Grob Chroniki or Grob Chronicles, which has this entire section of interviews, articles and whatnot about the band, and organized by date. So let's take a look at this. Actually, they're good, at least outwardly. They're quite normal, but there's no contact in general. I'm just noticing. I feel better with Siberians, firstly, and secondly. Siberian rock is 500 times cooler than Moscow and St. Petersburg rock. What do you mean, says Numev? Here in Siberia, punk is real punk. All movements come from an idea, and not from paraphernalia, like in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. So, well, essentially, there's a bunch of fan stuff on his site, though. I'll probably check it out. Basically, Letov is basically saying, with regards to the Leningrad rock scene that had bands like Kino, that had bands like Aquarium, that had bands like DDT, he's saying that they're all good bands, right? But they don't really embody the essence of like punk, and they don't really get like what it means to be punk, so to speak. Like, not in the sense that they don't resist, not in the sense that they don't, because they were resisting, not in the sense that they don't, like, do anything meaningful, but in the sense that there isn't really, like, God, I don't know how to put the words to it, because I don't want to say that there is no struggle, that there is no resistance, that there is no none of that, because there was. But when he says that here in Siberia, punk is real punk, all movements come from an idea, not from paraphernalia, yeah, essentially what he's saying is that the punk rooted in Siberia is punk that is rooted in the perpetuation of ideas, so to speak. Meanwhile, the punk movement in places like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, those are more rooted in like the aesthetic of what punk is. And so that's what he's saying separates him from the punk in Siberia, from the punk in Leningrad, or the punk in Moscow, for instance. And if you take a listen to like, also if you ever look into other Siberian wave bands such as IPV, check their noses. I swear every second member has a broken nose. Not sure whether because they kept slipping on ice. Maybe it's just the run-ins, or maybe it's the run-ins they had with the KGB. Who knows? Let's take a look at this one. It doesn't stem from the idea... let's take a look at this little snippet from Letov. It doesn't stem from the idea inherent in punk. What he refers to, like, Numev saying... Okay, so let's read for a bit of context. Well, why, says Numev, and the pig? I don't really know what he's referring to when he says the pig. Like, maybe referring to the politician, maybe referring to like police, but police in Russia are called musora. They're called garbage. So, not so to speak. They're called garbage in Russia. Not pigs like here in America. Maybe he's referring to pigs in the sense of like a politician, maybe Gorbachev. Who knows? Letov says, no, it's not punk at all. And Strukov says, well, how so? Numev replies, why do you think it doesn't come from an idea? Ricochet doesn't come from an idea. Yeah. Letov says, it doesn't stem from the idea inherent in punk. Punk is an inherently social movement, which is something that Svinya never had. A Svinya is some kind of indifferent hooligan, someone who makes fun of the most base things, like shit, for example. In fact, all of punk in the Soviet Union turned into some kind of Uralsk-type thing. The paraphernalia is completely Gopnik, Uralsk-type. In other words, it's making fun of the wrong things. So he's telling us that punk isn't about taking just base things and denying them. It is not a denial of the basic. It is a social movement. It is a look into the social and a critique of the social. Well, svinya means pig. It sounds like a generic term for someone disgusting. Probably. And like Letov says, a svinya is some kind of indifferent hooligan who makes fun of the most base things. That is what a svinya means to Letov. Basically, he's talking about somebody who is apathetic, somebody who just takes a look at the world around them and is just indifferent to it, which runs counter to Letov's philosophy of empathy and care. essentially. More on image says Strukov. Letov says yes, and not only on the image, but on some matters that never had anything to do with punk. Numoev says, the thing is that punk rock is originally Spanish rock. Part 3. Letov says no. Numoev says, well, what's it like? Wrestler's rock or something? Letov says, of course. Vulgar person, yeah. Somebody else says, initially it was Patti Smith. And Letov says, initially these were all sorts of intellectuals. Okay, let's scroll down a little bit. Numoev says, I think that punk is the philosophy of aggressive punks. Strukov says, yes, the punks have no thoughts at all. And Letov is basically mocking this, because that's why it's in quotes. He's saying, the punks have no thoughts. The philosophy of aggressive punks is a Luber. It's animal behavior. And punks are people who have overcome all of the problems and consciously arrived at primitivism. That's punk. That's why the Clash is a very intellectual punk band. Man, he's essentially mocking the idea that the philosophy of punk is like a primitivism. He's essentially mocking the idea that punks are people who basically just arrive at a primitive notion of themselves and of things and just act like hooligans. That's not what punk is to Letov. For Letov, what punk is essentially rooted, if we were to take his idea of the rocker, in a compassion, a empathy, a care. And so to lack that for Letov basically turns you into a hooligan, nothing more than like a thug, like, basically. And that's not punk to Letov, that's just being a thug. And so Numoev says, so you don't share the theory that punks are people who want to express themselves, but since they don't know how to play anything or play poorly, they grab guitars out of an excess energy, and what they get is this kind of energy but stupid music. And Letov says, no, I don't think so. Numoev says, you think punks are those who have gone through all of the music. Somebody else says, not necessarily all the music. Numoev says, well, good, we choose for ourselves. And let's go over this, I gotta use the bathroom for a second, and then we'll go over Letov's reply. Be right back. All three of you, don't go nowhere. It's gonna get interesting soon, I swear. Also, hi, Psychedelia98. You caught me at a bad time. I've gotta use the restroom, but I'll be right back to read the interview. Hopefully nobody left for that quick bathroom break. We still got 4 viewers. Hey. Nice. But yeah. So let's go over Letov's reply. If we're for a little bit of a recap. So actually we don't need the recap. I think most people probably have it in memory. They've been watching the stream. Letov replies, Punk is energy, aggression, but at the same time, it's a very intelligent aggression. Not metal, not urla. Punk is very intelligent movement. It's conceptualism. Punk is conceptualism, and conceptualism is the quality of very intelligent people. Intellectuals, at the very least. And intellectuals, specifically anti-aesthetes. This doesn't mean, by the way, that being an intellectual means being educated. A person has to be truly intelligent. I've seen people who are punks in the intellectual sense, who are 17 years old. Dima from Pop Mechanica is a showman. That doesn't depend on age. In any case, I take the same Stranglers. There's Stranglers referring to the punk band The Stranglers. Only an intelligent person could write a song like No More Heroes. The music itself is very cleverly composed. The Sex Pistols, Johnny Rotten is fucked. I was talking to a hippie and he compares Exploited and the Sex Pistols. The latter are clearly intellectuals in the highest sense. Smart music. They play smart. They sing smart. That's why Urla and all those metalheads don't understand punk. They hate it terribly. They can't even figure out what it is. There's a lot of double entendre in there. A lot of third level stuff. So Letov is basically saying in that entire whole screed that there is an intelligent nature to punk. And an intellectualism inherent to punk music. That separates itself from just metal, from pure aggression, from the aggression of Gopniks, for instance. We lost a guy, but that's okay. He says it's a very intelligent aggression, not metal, not urla. I don't know specifically what urla is referring to. Maybe Pure Copium has an answer. Considering they're probably more educated on this subject than I am, but basically he's saying that to be a punk rock, you have to have some sort of intellectualism about you, and that intellectualism is the root of punk. It is not the pure aggression. It is not the pure energy. It is the intellectualism. It is the intellectual nature of punk. So let's go for Strukov's answer. Gopniks are always infuriated by intellectual in general, and Letov replies, and punk is an intellectual movement. Strukov says, this gives the punks an inferiority complex, which is why they mostly treat punk that way. At best, they can only accept the energy and drive itself. Letov says, in general, you have to be a very complex person to accept primitivism. Okay, they're going on about I'm trying to see if there's anything okay, so basically talking about a band. And then Numev replies, do you think this is punk? And Letov says, after thinking, generally speaking, yes. Only it was played too well, I would say. Strukov says, was it played well? Letov says, academic. And that's why there's less drive. It's just not there. It's just not that there isn't, but the fact that Sanya plays the bass purely is the same. Strukov says, wait, there's no drive? There's no aggression there? It's just whining? What kind of punk is that? At best, it's a cry. There are even varieties of folk songs that are just crying. Somebody else says, it's the same thing, reggae, Rastafari. Strukov says, yes, reggae. Letov replies, punk and reggae are one and the same, which is an interesting thing. So this isn't a reply to somebody talking about, somebody else in the conversation referring to reggae as just whining, and Letov replying, punk and reggae is the same thing, because this is interesting to me. Reggae is rooted in the specific struggles of the Jamaican people, the specific struggles with poverty, specific struggles with racism, specific struggles with gang violence in this country, things that are parts of Jamaica. And so whenever you hear reggae music, it's typically this kind of laid back, groove where you get like where you get your guitar and you play a little rhythm like. But when you listen to the lyrics of the songs, there's very much an element to it of struggle. They talk about leaving Babylon. They talk about, they talk about like I shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot the deputy. They talk about, oh, I'll never forget, no way. They crucified Jesus Christ. I'll never forget, no way. They took Marcus Garvey for rice. And that's a lyric directly from Bob Marley. They talk about the ways in which that struggle has influenced their worldview. Oh, and they talk about, and yeah, there's talking about like smoking weed. There's talking about like I want to jam here with you. But ultimately, the core of reggae is the struggle. Oh, and so that is why I think Letov is saying punk and reggae are one and the same. Also, the Clash were heavily influenced by reggae and related music. Yeah, exactly. And that translated into punk music, into like songs like Guns of Brixton, into bands like the Specials, into like Operation Ivy, those bands. That translated into that because punk is essentially a struggle. It is a struggle between the individual and the society and the systems that oppress them. And so there's resonance within that struggle. Well, not necessarily resonance in the sense of like these are one and the same. Obviously, the conditions of a punk rocker is not going to be the same as the conditions of a Jamaican person, but it is unity in a struggle that unites punk and reggae. Okay, so let's read Letov's furthering this. Yes, punk and reggae are really close, he says. It just so happens that the new wave is entirely based on reggae. The Sex Pistols, as it turns out, emerged as a band that used to play reggae. I don't really know how true that is, but sure, we'll run with it. Even before they have albums, they were playing reggae. So what else is there to say? Yes, Bob Marley, and the page is just decided to translate it as Bub Marley for some reason. Nice jazz master, thank you. It's the Squire J. Mascis one. You can see the signature on the headstock right there. That's J. Mascis Dinosaur Jr. Amazing band. Yes, Bob Marley is pure punk rock. What else can I say? When a person is worried, when his soul is sick, and when he is in real pain, then everything he does turns out intelligent. Because when a person has suffered a lot, he becomes somehow wise. Wow, it's not even about intellect. A person who has been through a lot, who has felt bad, will no longer waste time on nonsense. That is, everything he does will be filled with some kind of meaning, simply. That is, he will not do anything superfluous, but he will not play crap, but do real things, like Shevchuk or Shaif. Oh yeah, Yuri Shev. So I have a John 5 telly that looks like Neil Young's guitar when he got it. Nice. So when he talks about Shevchuk, he's talking about Yuri Shevchuk. The guy who yeah, I just looked it up, is the main guy who's leading DDT. So he's essentially paying his compliments to DDT, and to like Chife, by saying that he's essentially saying that with regards to the thing that he's calling punk. He says, when a person is worried, when his soul is sick, and when he is in real pain, everything he does turns out intelligent, because when a person has suffered a lot, he becomes somehow wise. I don't take this to be as like a Schopenhauerian... You can take like a Schopenhauerian read of this by saying that like there's a necessary suffering inherent that needs to be had in order for you to like understand life. No. He's saying that intelligence is rooted in the struggle. Essentially, the intelligence of punk rock is rooted in inherently within the struggle that it has. So That's what he says when a person has been through a lot, who has felt bad, he will no longer waste time on nonsense. That is, everything he does will be filled with some kind of meaning. Simply, it's kind of like a semi-Buddhist approach to this, where like understanding that life is in and of itself suffering is a way in which somebody can it is the first noble truth of Buddhism, that life is suffering, not in the sense that life is bad, that life is terrible, but that life is simply a struggle between for Letov, between you and the powers at play. So, when you let that struggle inform your art, it essentially basically makes you a more intelligent person, so to speak. So Shukov replies, he just feels life. And so Letov replies, everything they do is already filled with meaning. It's some kind of intelligence, wisdom. Shukov replies, awareness, let's say. Letov replies, that's why I don't accept pig and never will. What he's doing is a kind of betrayal of fate. When he does such crap, it's offensive to say the least. So this one's also in quotes. So I feel like Letov is probably quoting somebody else, but it doesn't say who he's quoting. He doesn't explicitly say who he's quoting. So let's analyze this. That's why I don't accept Svinya and never will. What he's doing is kind of betrayal of fate. When someone does such crap, it's offensive to say the least. He's basically taking a rejection of the apathy of the he's basically taking a rejection of the apathy and indifference that somebody like a Svinya might have, the vulgar person, as Prokopian would say. It's essentially, he's saying that, there is no, look, even if there is no meaning to life, even if there is nothing to work for, even if we may as well just lay down and die, what matters is that we fight. What matters is not the indifference that we have. If nothing matters, then we should fight, essentially. We shouldn't just lie down and die because that's giving in to the systems at play. No, we should fight against those systems at play. That is what makes us human, so to speak. All right. By the way, says Shukov, are you familiar with the idea of commerçant? Let's look up what that means. Commerçant. Is that okay? Newspaper. Founded in 1989. Okay, that would be. Before 1992, simply commerçant. Okay, founded in 1989. God damn it, this isn't telling me anything. What does it translate to? Businessman, merchant, entrepreneur. Okay. Letov replies, terrorism? I know, I argued with him about it. And Letov says, there's another theory of the new left. And Letov says, I had a terrible fight with them about this. When we met, says Newmanov, I told him that he was either a KGB agent or a fool. Letov says, I told him differently. And this is also in quotes. I guess this is just selectively, I guess this article is just selectively putting things in quotes. I don't know if there's much meaning behind it. I told him differently. I told him that if I find out he's done anything like that, I'll start fighting him personally. I might just hand him over to the KGB. This guy is dangerous. Firstly, he's discrediting the entire punk movement. If he commits even one terrorist attack and calls himself a punk afterwards, we're all screwed. And secondly, what he's doing is anti-rock and anti-punk. It's what the It's what the Lubitzi are doing, only under a different banner. Same old fascism. So they're basically describing like a terrorist, somebody who basically just goes out and this might be specifically tied to a more historical context that I'm not aware of, but they're basically talking about a dangerous man, and somebody who by Letov's own words, threatens the punk movement. He's basically saying that this guy is going out committing just acts of terrorism and saying that these are acts of punk when they're not. That acts of punk. It is just like blanket terrorism. That is not punk. It is just in Letov's view the same old fascism. Punk to Letov in this implication would be tactical, would be like not just blanket violence for its own sake, would be violence maybe as a form of self-defense, or maybe as a rallying of the people in order to go against the state, not in like, oh, I firebombed the Walmart, aren't I so cool? No, you firebomb the Walmart you firebomb the Walmart when it is tactically advantageous to you. Shukov replies, "This looks more like a provocation." And Letov replies, "Yes, I was genuinely surprised when I found out..." How far am I into this interview? I don't know. "Yes, I was genuinely surprised when I found out that such people exist in the world." Newman says, "A man lives in a fashionable house, has done practically nothing up to now, and now he apparently wants something spicy, or for purely aesthetic reasons he's hooked on punk." Letov replies, "He has this idea that everything needs to be destroyed and is broken. I asked him, 'What do you even want?' And he says, 'We'll see what happens next.' I asked him, 'What happens next?' He replies, 'I want people to start thinking.' I asked him, 'Have you even started thinking yet?' Who knows, maybe you have." Basically, the guy is either a fool or something else. So basically, Letov is describing a conversation that he had with the guy, who basically thinks that everything just needs to be burned down to the ground, and whatever comes next doesn't matter. Letov is basically saying, no, you can't just commit general acts of terrorism without knowing what happens next. It's without a plan. No, you need a plan. Even if the end goal does not matter, you still need that end goal. Well, even if the means to which you arrive at that end goal matter far more than the ends, you still need the ends to begin with. And so what he's basically saying is that if his end goal is to get people to start thinking, then he should have them think about it. Then he should have them think about what his ultimate end goal is. Even if the ultimate purpose of punk is resistance, there should still be something to strive towards with that resistance. It can't just be, just blanket, just terrorism, just blanket, get targeting whatever, or do whatever you want, destroy everything in your path. No, it has to be tactical, is what Letov is saying, is what I'm taking him to say. So it goes on. It says, So Shukov says, "I argued with him so much, explained everything, and he says we needed to protect ourselves from the Lubers. Letov says, "By the way, he didn't tell me anything about the Lubers. The people worth fighting are the Lubers." And so, Shukov replies, "Kolya Rock and Roll brought this up about the Lubers. He said that the danger was brewing for the Lubers and the main danger was their unity." Letov replies, "Kolya speaks truthfully. I agree with him." And Shukov replies, "Their pamyat can simply recruit them." And Letov says, "By the way, I'm dedicating my next album to the Pamyat Society and the Lubers. All the songs will be about this. This is the most glaring and brutal danger right now. Never before has there been a danger to us, to the people who now live in the Soviet Union." So this is interesting to me for two reasons. This is interesting for me for a particular reason. So Letov has this song, Obchestva Pamyat. It's about this Russian anti-Semite fascist group called the Pamyat Society, the Memory Society. And what the song basically is a basically scathing satire on the group. He basically I'll pull up the lyrics right now. If I can, like, okay, so okay, copy that. Paste that. Okay. So basically I'm not going to read the lyrics to this. So I'm going to read some parts of the lyrics. So, the memory society is the red government, shot in the back and the soul is gone. The honeyed sweetness of bloody porridge, into a muddy well head down. The memory society, Russian terror, the righteous finger touched the trigger, the people's axe was generously sharpened, tomorrow will come the untimely end. The saber flashed, somebody's fucked, the bayonet pierced the hateful flesh. The memory society, our holy father, will lead us to tear and stab. And then the last verse, the wounds flared up on the dawn's ray, proud tribe, rise to battle, we call with the sword and cross. And this last line, YouTube, is part of the satire. He says, "Hang the Jews and save Russia." That is the motto of the Pamyat Society. Now, on a surface read, this could be potentially taken as like a monument to that society, and this was written in 1987, right when he like was talking right around the time when this interview happened. So, and he says right here, "This is the most glaring and brutal danger right now. Never before has there been such a danger to us, to the living people who now live in the Soviet Union." He basically describes the Pamyat Society as basically a danger. He wrote this song as like a scathing critique of them. He basically says these are people shot in the back and the soul is gone. These are people who know nothing more than just senseless violence against people. These are nothing more than people who will stab you in the back whenever they have the chance. And so these are people who are brutish, who think that their slogan, "Hang the Jews and save Russia," basically just means that these are people who basically think we dropped it to one viewer, damn. Who basically think that the motto, "Hang the Jews and save Russia," is a thing to held to, when in reality it is just a call to senseless violence. The Jews don't have power in Russia. The Jews aren't controlling anything in Russia. Hanging the Jews isn't going to save Russia. Letov is mocking this idea. Yeah. And he basically means, and when he basically says that Pamyat Society and the Lubers are the most glaring and brutal danger right now, this ties into the song because, as for Letov, these people are his enemies. These people are the ones who don't give a damn about Russian society, who don't actually give a damn about the Russian people. And so, he basically sees mockery of them as like the only way that we can treat them in any way. We should like essentially work to destroy the Pamyat Society. We should work to destroy the Lubers, because these people want to destroy the fabric of the society that we live in, and through their anti-Semitism, through their lack of care for the world, through their lack of empathy. And so, these people to Letov are a danger. Sure. So Shukov replies, "Black hundreds." Letov replies, "Yes, the Black Hundreds. Moreover, this wave of patriotism," he puts in quotation marks, "is growing every day, growing right before our eyes, getting stronger and stronger in every city. It's reminiscent of Germany in 1933, literally in every aspect. I'm afraid the same might happen. I'm afraid that we won't end up in the same situation as that part of the intelligentsia who immediately defected when the putsch began there in 1937. So, the Black Hundreds. Let's take a look at what the Black Hundreds are. Black Hundreds, Russia. The Black Hundreds were reactionary monarchist and ultranational groups in Russia during the early 20th century. They were staunch supporters of the House of Romanov and the Black Hundreds were noted for extremism and incitement of pogroms, nationalistic Russo-centric doctrines, as well as xenophobic beliefs, including anti-Semitism, anti-Polish sentiment, and anti-Catholic sentiment, as well as sentiment against the Ukrainian secessionism. Now, some people might think that this is ironic, given that, like, Letov would later co-found the National Bolshevik Party with Dugin and Limonov, but I don't take Letov to be a fascist. I take him more to be just a cultural and linguistic nationalist, in the sense that he thinks that there's value in preserving the Russian culture and in preserving the Russian language. Which, when he talks about like when he puts patriotism in quotation marks, he's not like blanketly like condemning patriotism in its whole. He's basically saying that their patriotism is a bad patriotism, so to speak. He's saying that he hates these fascists, the Black Hundreds. He hates the Pamyat Society. He hates the Lurers. That is what his project is against. Sorry, my nose. And so, he says it's reminiscent of Germany in 1933. He basically thinks that there's a danger to fascism, there's a danger inherently to these ultranationalist movements that seek to be hooligans, that seek to be violent for the purposes of their own patriotism and their own nationalism. And this ties into a statement that he made in 2004 after an incident in at a Grab concert where somebody died. He basically, I have a translation of it somewhere in my notes. So let me see if, in the script that I'm writing for the Letov video, when I talk about whether Letov was a fascist or not, I basically lay out this quote. So this was in 2004. We have no active or decisive connection with any Uranian nationalist movements. We are patriots, but not Nazis. It must be acknowledged that today, everywhere, we are witnessing not just the birth, but the total and aggressive advance of fascism. Not the colorful, abstract, heroic kind, but the most natural, rat-like, insect-like kind we've already experienced in our own backsides. Anyone who doesn't like to march in step with anyone who's yourself, anyone who's alive, fight it as best you can. Anywhere before it's too late. Don't stand there in dumb spectatorship and gaping sorrow. All totalitarians, right and left, all shades and colors, go fuck yourself. We kindly ask that you no longer associate your stench with our activities. That is pretty much as clear an indictment of fascism as I think you can get with Letov. Because yes, he was a nationalist. Yes, he was somebody who believed that yes, he was somebody who did march with who did do work with what was essentially, I could best describe, a far right party in Russia, but he was not far right. He was not a fascist. He hated fascism, and his entire project was against what he saw as fascism. So, this just kind of illustrates to me further that his hatred for the fascist project. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see if there's anything that he is like. I wonder if Pure Copium's still in chat. We still have like one person left still watching, but okay. Here's an interesting one. Numilo says, do you think it's possible for us to create something of our own? After all, we take so much, almost everything from empirical data. Everything we've heard in our lives has somehow been digested and mixed up. Letov says, so it is necessary. Nuev says, you also heard a lot, which means you also rip off. Letov says, I believe that the entire rock culture in the world is one. I am convinced that I am in the same position as, say, Rotten, referring to Johnny Rotten. I don't feel divided between here and there. If you dig deeper, I consider myself on par with, say, The Clash. That is, if I were there, I would go up to them in the same way and talk. We are stewing the same pot. So I didn't feel divided between us and themselves. And Grebenshikov feels that he is here and they are there. Why is our country lagging behind in terms of rock? Because rock culture constantly feels that it is here and they are there. I don't feel like I live here. Everything is one. Like some kind of rock cauldron. I listen to Iggy Pop and I communicate with him. We are together, two brothers. He sings for me, I sing for him. I believe that music is made for musicians, artists paint for artists, poets paint for poets. Only musicians, punks, can appreciate your song. And I don't even mean so much musicians, but people who... Shukov interrupts and says, well, that's clear. Letov says, that's why for me punk that existed in the West isn't the same as in the West here. Somebody's Discord. Okay. The West isn't the same... Okay, let's start again. That's why punk for me, Letov is saying this, punk that has existed in the West isn't the same as in the West or here. There's just punk, and then there's non-punk. Let's say the punk they play in, say, Prague. That's punk that's cooler than, say, Exploited or some Dragons from China. Even cooler than our punk, let's say, you put together. We're simply one culture, one whole, one melting pot. But if, say, Grebenshikov, referring to Boris Grebenshikov, the frontman for Aquarium, subconsciously, I feel like he divides into Soviet and Western. That's why Poles, like Brigada Kri, people listen to them. Like in England, too. The records are released there. It's all a blast. And DK will be out soon, I hope. I think DK might refer to Dead Kennedys. But essentially, Letov is taking this universalist approach to the concept of rock, basically saying that rock in Russia is an extension of rock in England, is an extension of rock in the United States, and is an extension of rock in Canada, so on and so forth. He says, we are stewing in the same pot, so I don't feel divided between us and them. And Grebenshikov constantly feels that he is here and they are there. Why is our country lagging behind in terms of rock? Because rock culture constantly feels that it is here and they are there. So he's essentially saying that the Soviet rock of the time was divided into an us and a them, when in reality this stuff is interlinked. And that is the mistake that it makes whenever there's like... That is the mistake that most Soviet rock makes, that it is unique for itself. That is the mistake that I think Letov is referring to. He's saying we're simply one culture, one whole, one melting pot. He's essentially saying that like rock is the thing that unites people in terms of art, in terms of like punk in general, is the art itself, is the art of punk, which Letov would deny as an art, but I'm just using for like pragmatic purposes. Numaev says, so you think that punk has no national roots? Shukov says, in rock in general, and then Letov says, at fate? Numaev says, even rock, we somehow actually mistook rock for punk. Real rock is punk. Numaev says, yes, that's absolutely clear. No, Letov says, yes, that's absolutely clear. Numaev says, so he has no national roots. Letov says, yes, only these roots are unique to everyone, but in general, if you dig deeper, everyone has the same roots. All folk culture, all world culture is essentially similar. This ties into his universalism, basically saying that at its core, regardless of what culture that we have, regardless of what how unique we are, at our roots, we all derive from the same thing. Our essence is essentially the same. Some might say that this conflicts with with the nationalism that he adopted in the 90s, but I think the nationalism that he adopts in the 90s is like a universalist nationalism, if that makes sense. Like I think he still maintained that there were unique cultures worth preserving, but at the same time that we are all at our roots universally connected in the same essence, so to speak. So somebody else says, yes, there's only one. Letov replies, whether it's Africa or Russia, all this shamanic stuff in the villages, so some American Indians, or some Milanese orchestra, or some Australian one, it's all the same. I've listened to African stuff, truly traditional folk stuff. I've heard Pokrovsky's ensemble sings. Everything Pokrovsky does is punk rock. It's rock in its purest form, with a drive that neither Led Zeppelin nor Yes could dream of. When I watched Musical Ring with Pokrovsky, I screamed the whole concert. I danced. I wrote Anarchy on the Wall, because what they do is pure rock. All this folk stuff, whether it's Africa or America, I've listened to Chukchi folk music. What they do, even Iggy Pop couldn't dream of. Everything that people do is human culture, which is one root. And Shukov says, and here we call it cosmopolitanism. Letov replies, by the way, Russian folk culture, what we have in all sorts of villages is shamanic. All these songs like In the Field a Birch Tree Stood, that's not culture. That was all planned by Peter the Great. It's a European romance. It has nothing to do with Russia, with culture, with folk deeds. And balalaikas aren't Russian instruments. They were bought from Italy, and neither is the accordion. And somebody replies, Roland Bykov in Andrei Rublev, that's a movie. Letov says, yes, this is punk rock. People's affairs. And it goes on. Okay, there's a touch on Christianity here. So let's take a look at the Christianity aspect. Shukov says, Christianity was like the implantation of the apparatus. Oh, let's read this before this, so. Let's see. Letov says, Zharikov from the community center, by the way, was right in saying that these are all folk affairs that have deep roots. All the rituals are the same, and all matters concerning faith, the sun, the moon, and in general, the attitude towards life is the same for everyone, for all peoples. Pure Copium says, he was very much a nationalist and denied the nationhood of former Soviet nations. It's a reverse type of universalism, essentially saying everyone in the Soviet Union is one nation, Russian. Yeah. Essentially. Yeah, the thing about Letov's nationalism is that I don't take it to be like an ethnic nationalism. I don't take it to be like a nationalism of superiority, more so a nationalism of like cultural preservation, so to speak. Shukov says, Christianity was like the implantation of an apparatus. Letov says, of course, but what Christ taught was not Christianity. What Christ taught never came anywhere. Somebody else replies, Christianity was entirely built on the epistles of Paul. Yegor replies, yes, and on the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is basically Judaism, fascist deeds. Orthodoxy is based on a kind of dislike of life. I went to the Kiev Lavra in Kiev, and they have caves where all sorts of 12th century saints lie in coffins. So it's a cult of death, not of life. I went outside and immediately thought of Bob Marley. Now that's religion. I get it. Those guys believed and play along. Any Johnny Rotten has more faith than the monks who buried themselves underground. And kind of ironic that he talks about Johnny Rotten, considering later on Johnny Rotten would be a Trump supporter, but Letov didn't get to see the results of that. He died before Rotten ever did. Not ethnic in the sense of blood nationalism, but very much Russian supremacist at a certain point. It's maybe if we were to take his support for the Chechen wars, but I don't really know if he is a Russian supremacist, so to speak. Like, he did end up having a break with the National Bolshevik Party come 1996, where he essentially said, in another interview, he said, I'm leaving the National Bolshevik Party, and I encourage everybody who has joined because of me to turn in their cards, basically. I don't know if Letov was ever like truly a Russian supremacist in the sense of like Dugin was. That's why I said at certain points, yeah, it makes sense. But Letov probably wasn't a supremacist in the sense that like Dugin was a supremacist. But continuing. Continuing with the analysis. He says, he basically calls the Old Testament also not ethnic in the Western understanding. Yeah, there's probably like a different understanding of like ethnic nationalism with regards to like Russian culture as opposed to like Western culture, but as I understand it, Letov wasn't an ethnic nationalist. So when Letov says, yes, and on the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is basically Judaism, fascist deeds, he's not what I'm taking this to be like a more Nietzschean read of like the Old Testament, and not in the sense where in the sense that he describes where he says basically Judaism a deed of fascism. He's not saying that like, oh, if you're Jewish ethnically or otherwise, you're a fascist. No, he's basically saying that the doctrine of Judaism, of the religion of Judaism, is a fascist one, and basically he cites the Old Testament for this, because the God in the Old Testament is not the God in the is different from the God in the New Testament. Excuse me. What he's basically saying is that by being rooted in these Judea roots, he's not saying that there's something inherent to Judaism as a culture, as an ethnic group, as a religion, whatnot. He's not saying that. He's not going on the Hitler shit. He's going on Nietzsche shit. And what Nietzsche shit is basically, okay, there are these roots to this ideology that are like inherently in some ways fascistic, that inherently impose a control of something over another. And that is what I take to mean as him saying that it is fascist deeds. When he says orthodoxy is based on the dislike of life, I'm assuming he's referring to Orthodox Christianity, which is the prominent religion in Russia, still is in generally most of Eastern Europe. He basically describes like going to Kiev, seeing these coffins, and coming to the conclusion that it is a cult of death and not life. And so what he says is that the Orthodox Christians essentially celebrate death. They take death as the highest deed, and as opposed to living life. And so by being dead, they revere you more than by being alive. He brings up the example of Bob Marley, saying, now that's religion, and I get it. Those guys believed and played along. Bob Marley was a Rastafarian, basically a specific form of Christianity that takes, let me refresh myself on it really quickly, because I don't want to get it wrong. It's an Abrahamic religion. Okay, AI overview is saying, Abrahamic and social movement, central to its practices, believe in a single God, referred to as John, the divinity of Haile Selassie I. Zion versus Babylon. Practitioners view themselves as part of the African diaspora, seeking return to Zion, the symbolic promised land and original home of Africa. Contrast this with Babylon, a term for the corrupt, materialistic, and oppressive capitalist systems of the Western world. So when he refers to Bob Marley, a practicing Rastafarian, he's essentially saying that Bob Marley was somebody who had these very strong beliefs in Rastafarianism, in this struggle between Zion and Babylon, so to speak, that was rooted in his music. And thus that music spoke truth to power because of that struggle. So Numenov asks him, what do you think about different combinations? Punk soul, punk jazz. Letov says, I have good attitude. When you have stylistic guidelines like Exploited or Dead Kennedys, it's no longer punk. It's no longer rock. It's crap. And so Letov is basically saying, with this short little thing, that you should create bastardizations of punk. You should make punk jazz. You should make punk soul. Because when you have these guidelines for what punk should be, it stops becoming punk. It essentially just becomes what he calls crap. And he cites the Exploited and Dead Kennedys. I think he was like, earlier in the interview, he had like some positive things to say about, oh no, he didn't like the Dead Kennedys. Damn. Shame. It's a shame. The Dead Kennedys are like probably one of the most creative and amazing punk groups out there. But regardless, this there's an interesting thing that he says that they touch upon right here. So Numerev says, you yourself said that it's not your own. In short, the idea that punk has its own aesthetic. Letov says, I don't understand it. As soon as aesthetics appeared, it was pop. As soon as the concept that this aesthetics was emerged, as soon as the program emerged, program, aesthetics, and then Numerev says, Yegor, tell me firmly, like, does punk have no aesthetics? Letov replies, no. No. And so somebody else replies, well, of course it can't be. When you try to compose your songs melodically, Letov replies, well, I'm trying because I enjoy it, and other people enjoy something else. I'm not pretending. Shukov replies, ideal punk. Letov says, no, there can't be such a thing, ideal punk. Although I've listened to Scheif, and in my opinion, that's punk too. They play punk, they just have their own brand of punk. Ilam, for example, is a band, a third-wave punk band, and they play harmonicas, which is also punk. As soon as any kind of clear aesthetic emerges, any kind of clear system of rules and views, that's pop. Up. So Letov basically makes the distinction between punk and pop. Punk is not something rooted in aesthetics. Punk is not something rooted in rules. Punk is rooted in the rejection of those rules, in a resistance of those rules. Whereas pop is a life set that is ruled by a strict adherence to these rules, to there being a set aesthetic, to there being a set number of instruments to that music, to there being like guidelines to follow, and yeah, makes a lot of sense. Since if you have an ideology of like resistance, if you have an ideology of not adhering to rules, why would you then have guidelines and rules to describe what punk is? Even the act of describing what punk is would probably be an adherence to rules, when Letov describes certain things as punk, he doesn't describe them in a sense of like, oh, they're real punk. He describes them in a sense of like, oh, they embody the punk spirit. That's why he describes things like Bob Marley. He describes things like bands who play harmonica as bands who play jazz as punk, because they embody a certain attitude for him. They embody a spirit, so to speak. So that's the end of that interview. Let's take a look at let's see if there's any more let's see if there's like let's try to find one more interview to end this off at. Let's see this one. Okay, this one's from 1990. Let's see. Nothing interesting here. Let's take a look at 91. Nothing interesting here. 92, maybe. Damn, nothing. 93? Nope. How about 94? Because it says listed as an interview. Civil corrosion of rock and roll. Okay, let's see. Okay, so that's an interview with somebody else. Nothing in 95. How about 96? This one's after a performance. Okay. Okay. '96. All right. All right. I think we'll read this last interview just to like close this off because we're at 2 hours already, and we have like what 2 viewers. So here we go. All right. So the interviewer asks Letov, "What do you think about Edward Limanov's decision to support Yeltsin in the elections?" And Letov says this: "I want to make an official statement that I am leaving the National Bolshevik Party, and I wish to have nothing more to do with it. I also call on my supporters in this party to leave its ranks. I supported this party as long as its extremism was Russian, understandable, for the benefit of society, and sober. Now it has become purely shocking, a parody a la Yukio Mishima. In general, it has become anecdotal, and I'm very sad that I was involved in this. I realized this about a year ago, and therefore I haven't written for Limonka, that's the Russian Nazbol's newspaper, for a long time, and I haven't had much direct contact with them. And the red banner must be taken away from Limonov, because he is no longer a red one and has no right to stand under it. Right. The National Bolshevik Party was founded by a man who is not involved in serious politics, and his interests have nothing in common with the interests of the majority of people in Russia. So his current declaration and support for Yeltsin is pure shock value, and it's outrageous, ridiculous. It's not even funny. It's not that it's scary or dangerous. It's just not funny. It's just some kind of sick curiosity. This is clearly the result of someone who doesn't understand reality. This kind of shock value might be fine in France or New York, but here it's not even shock value. It's just stupidity. It's delusional." So here Letov is explaining why he left the Nazbols in Russia. So he says here, "I supported this party as long as its extremism was Russian, understandable, for the benefit of society, and sober." So he viewed the Russian Nazbols as Vol's extremism as something that was for the benefit of society, in essence. He viewed it as something that addressed the particular concerns of the Russian people at the time that Yeltsin was president, and he is essentially saying, I have once supported this movement. It was something that I believed in, and it was something that I saw as the next logical step to my resistance of authority. And now he says, "Now it has become purely shocking, a parody a la Yukio Mishima. In general, it has become anecdotal, and I'm very sad that I was involved in this," essentially expressing regret that he ever involved himself with the Russian National Bolsheviks. Calls it a parody a la Yukio Mishima, which is interesting. I don't really know much about Mishima, so let's look him up. Let's look up what some of his views are. Mishima's political activities made him a controversial figure in Japan. Far-right ideology and reactionary beliefs became increasingly evident. He extolled the traditional culture and spirit of Japan and opposed what he saw as Western-style materialism, along with Japan's post-war democracy, globalism, and communism. So definitely would have been opposed to Letov, who like towards his time in the National Bolsheviks believed in a sort of national communism, worrying that by embracing these ideas would lose their national essence and distinctive cultural heritage and become a rootless people. So Mishima's particular form of nationalism, so being something rooted in tradition, in something rooted in very blanket patriotism, very blanket opposition to very blanket opposition to the Western world, very blanket opposition to communism, would have been something that Letov opposed. One because he started to like adopt communism and in the 90s, and two because Letov was not a traditionalist. He was somebody who believed in the destruction of tradition. He was somebody who believed in resistance, and so resistance required the destruction of tradition to Letov. Let's continue. Let's put it this way. From time to time, situations arise when you have to work together with a certain kind of people in a united front. And then one of these people, suffering from a kind of leaderism that stems from an inferiority complex, gathers people in the same trenches to a single party under his personal leadership and leads them God knows where, as long as he leads them and always follows him. Then you want to ask those who follow him, what kind of people are you, comrades? I'm not a member of any party, but I consider myself a communist, because I have my own head on my shoulders and I know what I want, what I need. I know that I live in my own country, I walk on my native soil, and for me what matters is not ideology, but a specific reality, the very concrete truth of life. Therefore, I advise everyone who, for one reason or another, has joined certain parties or groups under pressure from the situation to figure out now where they are being dragged, how they're being used, and make their final choice. He was not a clear, non-discriminating, absolute anti-traditionalist. I disagree partly. From what I've read of Letov, I haven't really taken him to be a traditionalist. I take him more to be a cultural preservationist. Somebody who is a traditionalist would be somebody like Dugin, for example. Somebody who believes that like Western values are eroding the traditions of Russia and that we must return to those traditions. Letov believed that Western values were eroding Russia because of the introduction of capitalism, shock doctrine, Yeltsin, etc. He thought that it was one culture imposing itself upon another culture, so to speak. And so that was his opposition to the West. Dugin's opposition to the West was more so as I see it, as I understand Dugin's philosophy, in opposition to like Western values in general, just an opposition to progressivism, and that opposition to progressivism is largely what informs Dugin's ideology. It is a look at tradition as the highest form of good, and thus that highest form of good must be maintained at all cost. I would also not take Dugin seriously in any way, or perhaps wouldn't take Dugin as a serious person. Oh, I don't take Dugin seriously either. I fucking hate Dugin. And I'm very confused as to why Letov would even let himself 5 feet near Dugin in any way possible. Well, that was one of Letov's greatest mistakes, in my view, was giving Dugin the legitimacy that he had. Not to say he's a funny or harmless person. He's definitely not a funny or harmless person. He's done very real damage with his philosophy, which is currently one of the things influencing Vladimir Putin right now to encroach upon Ukraine. But when I say I don't take him seriously, I mean that his philosophy is not a serious one. It is not one rooted in like anything other than just blanket. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by no pure copium? I guess I'll continue. Let's see. Where was I at? At one point in a certain situation, we found ourselves in the same party with Limonov, but that situation has changed, and it turns out we were on opposite sides of the barricades. There's a clear division now between two camps. One is the market camp, the enemy, and the other is the communal camp, ours. We need to be very careful about who stands for what, who says what. The attitude towards the market is the most important dividing line, not only for parties in general. Well, the main thing that separates communists and quote-unquote Democrats is the difference between the private, alienated, isolated, and communal. So essentially, he's basically saying that he realizes now that Limonov and Dugin and the rest of the National Bolshevik Party are fundamentally opposed to him. that where once he saw allies united in a cause against Yeltsin, he now sees these people. He now sees just another group striving for striving for more power, striving for control. And remember, power is what. And remember from that last interview, power is one of the things that Letov strives against. So and totalitarianism is interlinked with power. So Letov basically is saying that how do I put this? Where once he saw from what I've heard, Dugin doesn't influence Putin, but rather compiles ideas already present and entrenched in Russian society. I've encountered this multiple times. Okay, that clarifies stuff. Okay, that's clarifying. But going back to Dugin, I think his support for the Russia-Ukraine stuff, on the side of Russia, is primarily based upon the idea that Ukraine is just having been a former Soviet country is a part of is rightful Russian territory. I don't know if Letov, being the Soviet romantic that he was later on in life, would have thought the same thing, but he probably. But if I were to take something from these interviews, it would probably be that based off of the context of interviews of different sources, he'd probably be in some way against what Putin is doing, because what Putin is doing is essentially not a denazification. It is not a reclaiming of rightful land. No, it is imperialism, plain and simple. Well, it is plain and simple imperialism. And that, I think, would stand in opposition to Letov, who was pretty much against a culture encroaching itself upon other cultures, so to speak. All right, so the interviewer says, "And tell me, as the leader of the Russian breakthrough movement, who will you support in the presidential elections?" Letov says, "We will support left-wing forces, communist forces, only communist forces, nothing else. We will unequivocally support a single candidate from the left. Since Russian breakthrough is a radical communist movement, we have some differences, but all these details are nothing compared to overall shared victory." So the Russian breakthrough is this very specific cultural movement. And it was basically somewhat of a nationalist movement, I would say, that basically wanted to address the conditions and the concerns of the Russian people. I don't know specifically the details of the Russian breakthrough, but it's very much associated with Letov, very much associated with Limonov, very much associated with, at least to some degree, the Russian Nazpol Party. And here, Letov basically says the Russian breakthrough is a radical communist movement. We have some differences, but all these details are nothing compared to the overall shared victory. So he essentially describes the Russian breakthrough, or the concept of the Russian breakthrough, as at its fundamental core a leftist movement. Which of these existing parties and movements is closest to you? Letov says, "I'm closer to Trudovaya Russia, and I'd like to collaborate with them." Let's look up what Trudovaya Russia is. The Trudoviks were Democratic Socialist Party of Russia. Labor Russia. There's a hardline communist and nationalist movement in Russia. by Viktor Anpilov, a hardline Russian communist. I'm pretty sure it refers to a series of concerts, including that Lenin is Young Again performance with the giant Nazbol flag. Probably, yeah. So Labor Russia so what I'm reading here, Labor Russia is basically like, what would be the American equivalent to Labor Russia? Would it be like, he was talking about Proryev? Not with RWCP, not with Tyulkin, but with Anpilov and the Trudovaya Russia. Although they too had certain flaws and excesses, I recommend that everyone watch One-on-One with Anpilov and Zhirinovsky. It turned out to be a very good, very revealing program. Zhirinovsky simply resorted to rudeness when he started being rude when he realized he was losing to Anpilov, while Anpilov calmly carried the program to the end. Despite the fact that the audience was Zhirinovsky's and Lyubimov was playing along with him, them improving his moves and ridiculing Anpilov. Oh, I was talking about So Letov is basically saying that he aligns himself with the hardline communists in Russia, as opposed to the Nazbols at the time that this interview was created. He basically is singing praises to somebody named Anpilov, who, if we look up on Google, is Viktor Anpilov, a hardline communist and politician and trade unionist, died in 2018. Rest in peace. Or rest in peace critically. I don't know if he was like a... I don't know what specific views he held. Stalin Bloc for the USSR says, a coalition of communist parties in Russia running together for the 1999 elections of the State Duma. Okay. He was anti-Yeltsin. This guy seems like, okay. This guy Anpilov seems pretty chill, so to speak. I don't know much of the specifics of his actions or what he's done, any statements that he's made, but yeah. Interviewer says, I have long noticed that the Democrats both fear and love Zhirinovsky at the same time. Let's look up who Zhirinovsky is. Former member of the State Duma, died 2022. Right-wing populist who served as the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia from his creation in 1992 until his death in 2022. Okay, so this guy fucking sucks, probably. He served as a deputy chairman of the State Duma from 1993 to 2000, and from 2011 until 2022. Zhirinovsky was known for many controversies, as well as staunch advocacy for Russian military action against NATO. Oh, so this guy really fucking sucks. Putin-era political career. Let's look at that. Okay, Zhirinovsky campaigned in the 2008 presidential election, promising a police state with summary executions. Jesus fucking Christ. 30-second election video. Zhirinovsky's donkey video. In the video, Zhirinovsky claimed that little wretched donkey is a symbol of Russia, and that if he were to become president in a daring troika, he would return as a symbol of the country, which got stuck in one place just as the donkey. After this, Zhirinovsky whipped the animal to move the sleigh across the slope. Animal rights, so fair, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so this Zhirinovsky guy is a piece of shit, basically, is what I'm taking from his Wikipedia page. Letov says, of course he's a Democrat, in quotation marks, himself. Zhirinovsky fulfills very specific functions, sometimes to frighten people, sometimes to steal nationalist votes. Zhirinovsky and Chernomyrdin are now one. Let's look up who Chernomyrdin is. Viktor Chernomyrdin, a Soviet politician and businessman, minister of the gas industry of the Soviet Union, after which he became the first chairman of Gazprom. Oh no, not Gazprom. Oh, God. He was Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. Gaidar was considered a liberal reformist. This led Yeltsin to instead nominate Chernomyrdin. Chernomyrdin was not regarded to have established much of a political identity, so he's a Nepo baby. He's essentially Yeltsin's Nepo baby, basically. Okay. So when he says Zhirinovsky and Chernomyrdin are now one and the same, he's basically calling them both opportunists, basically, if I'm correct. What do you think about the split among radical parties? Letov says, a split has occurred along the lines of market versus non-market, with those parties that genuinely want to act in the interest of the people siding with the left, opposing them who are those who seek to amass political capital at any cost, those who play games. Every person in this country, party member or not, must have a clear head on their shoulders and make a clear choice. It is not about Zhuganov or Yeltsin, but about the ideology behind them. One way or another, a real revolution is impossible right now, but if you're interested in truly doing something for the people, you must make a choice. Either you're with the right or you're with the left. We are leftists, and we will always be. From my recent interviews, it was clear that I'm leaving Limanov's party, the party of radical nationalists, because of fundamental disagreements with them about the path of our country's development. I believe that communism is a truly Russian idea, and all marketeers, nationalists, Democrats, and whoever else are not true Russian patriots. That is, marketeers are people who are not Russian in their consciousness. They're pro-Western elements. Also, digression, I think DK from earlier refers to a Soviet band, Yegor's brother Sergei, and not the dead Kennedys. In the interview, he does mention the dead Kennedys, specifically, so, by name. So, Letov is basically saying, with regards to the split in the left, on the radicals, he's saying that there's a definitive split between those on the left and those on the right. What the left wants is non-markets. What the left wants is essentially the communal type of freedom. What the left wants is freedom, basically. A freedom to live, a freedom to partake in what you want to partake in, those kinds of stuff. And for the right, they want the markets. They want the control. What they want is essentially to perpetuate the systems that oppress the people. Well, only this time they'll be the ones in charge of those systems. And so what Letov is saying with this election is that you have two choices. Do you want to continue the oppression that you've lived under, or do you want to live a life that is free? And that's what he says when he means it's not about Zhuganov or Yeltsin, but about the ideology behind them. He sees the ideology behind Zhuganov as one of freedom, and the ideology behind Yeltsin as one of control. And that is where I think the split between him and Limanov come in. Essentially, what is going on is Limanov supports Yeltsin because he wants to curry favor with Yeltsin. He wants to have more control over the systems that are in play. He wants to be the one in charge. Letov is not concerned with being in charge. He wants the freedom of the people. And so that is where they diverged, and that is why Letov left. And so the interviewer asks, are you not going to create your own party? Letov says, no, I'm not going to, because I think all this party creation thing is utter nonsense. We need one large unified party that doesn't exist yet. For me, it would be ideal if the CPRF and Anpelov's Labor Russia created a single party. The CPRF represents the conservative wing of the communists, and Labor Russia represents the radical wing. Any living movement, any living party should contain both, and if they unite, they'll join the party immediately. A party should unite radical forces, those at the rallies, those with real clout on the ground, and conservative forces, those who represent the state machine. You could say the CPRF and Labor Russia are two halves of a single party, largely artificially torn apart. So let's take an analysis of what Letov is saying. Basically, he thinks that the creation of more parties as a response to disagreements within parties that you were part of is complete and utter nonsense. He thinks it's sectarianism. What Letov says is that the communists, regardless of their differences, regardless of what they have indifference with the other communists should unite as communists, so to speak. Whether they be communists in a more conservative sense, or Maoists, or Stalinists, or anarcho-communists, they are communists nonetheless. And so what his solution is not something that is what he acknowledges does not exist yet. But he says that those parties should unite, and that any split within those parties is useless. He calls it utter. He says, I think all this party creation thing is utter nonsense. And if I could go on a slight tangent a bit, Bad Empanada, YouTuber Bad Empanada, had a video titled, I think it was titled, What the American Left Should Do. And his proposed solution was to create a third party that siphoned off members from the DSA, that siphoned off members from all these political parties, that served as its own little faction in order to curry favor with the locals within that area. Yeah. But the problem that I would see with this is that for one, outside of the problems of you're essentially saying that we should start a people's movement, a people's guerrilla movement against the United States government, the most powerful military in the world, regardless of how many wars they've lost against, like Vietnam, Iran, Iraq, whatever. We are still talking about the world's most powerful military, and that being turned on its people would be a fucking disaster, so to speak. But this is an approach that encourages is absolutely no unity among anybody from a common goal. It only serves to divide. It serves to create arbitrary differences between the Stalinists, the Maoists, the Marxist-Leninists, the anarcho-communists, when they should be united under communism, regardless of how different that vision of communism looks. We should be united under the common enemy of the capitalist, of the Western man, of those people who seek to oppress us. We will sort out the differences that we have once we have communism. But until then, and Letov might say the same thing, the unity among communists is what matters the most. So the interviewer says, at the bottom, sometimes it's not even possible to clearly separate them. All the actions are carried together. Letov says, yes, that's how it is in Omsk. We need to unite before it's too late. We need to first deal with the common enemy and then hold debates in the Central Committee. Let's see. Okay. The interviewer says, would you like to take part in some political action? Letov says, we need to carry out and this is the final part of the interview, we need to carry out not just a protest, but a specific political move. But not a shocking move, not Limonov style, but a normal one, because normal, humane, patriotic things, in the highest sense of the word, produce a much greater effect, while Limonov-style shock tactics lead to just the opposite, to desolation and to stagnation. These ultranationalists simply cannot understand this. I believe that what we are doing now is right. There is a time to destroy and there is a time to create. The time for destruction is over, and we must rise from the ashes and rebuild our motherland, the Soviet Union, Russia. So, interesting. So this is an interesting thing. Letov in the 90s was basically engaged in Soviet romanticism, not because in my opinion, he thinks that the Soviet Union was good or anything. He obviously fought against it, but because the Soviet Union to him was a familiar hell. It was a hell, sure, but it was a familiar one, a particularly Russian hell. And it was a hell that brought to light the specific conditions and struggles of the Russian people. That's where his nationalism comes in this idea that we must oppose the West in favor of something more Russian. All this trash, he says, all these Zhirinovskys, Chubais, Novodvorskys, Kovalevs, Yeltsins, Barkashovs, Sobchaks, Vasilyevs, Starovoitovs, Solzhenitsyns, Limanovs, Gaidars, Fyodorovs, Yakunins, Popovs, and others should be consigned to the dustbin of history. I'm not ceasing my collaboration with all radical communist parties, but everyone needs to figure out who they're with and what they're doing. Are they just out for shock value, or are they truly committed to working for the good of the motherland and creating? Left-wing forces have effectively united, and those who have left effectively joined the other camp. Those who are not with us are against us, and we must understand that. So yeah, that was the end of the interview. Let's take a look at what Letov says about everyone needs to figure out who they're with and what they're doing. Are they just out for shock value, or are they truly committed to working for the good of the motherland and creating? Is basically saying, okay, there are two sides to this. One is the side of the radical communists, the people who believe in unity among, whether that be national grounds, communist grounds, political grounds, social grounds, philosophical grounds, unity among those lines. And they're the people who are just out there for the shock value of a thing, who are just out there not to create something better for the Russian people, not to create something new for the Russian people, but who are out there for themselves, who are out there just to bring attention to themselves, just so they can get the power over the systems that oppress others, because they want to be the ones in control of those systems. And the people need to decide at the moment whether or not they want to be on the side of the shock jocks or the people who actually want a better Russia. And when he says, left-wing forces have effectively united, and those who have left effectively joined the other camp, he is essentially saying, okay, the left in Russia at this current moment is at a crossroads. Those who are still part of the left are united with other people under a common cause, under the cause of communism and against the cause of capitalism. And those who have left that camp are essentially in it for themselves. They just want to be the next Lenin, the next Stalin, the next Hitler, the next whoever. They want to be the next dictator. And so you are essentially left with a choice. Do you choose the side of the people who are for the benefit of Russia, who are for the benefit of the people living in it, who are for the benefit of all people everywhere, essentially, or are you for the benefit of the people who just want to be the next who just want to be the next Yeltsin, who just want to be the next Stalin, who just want to be the next Lenin, in the sense that they just want to be the dictators, the ones in control of everything. So that's my read of it. So yeah, those were the two interviews that we decided to look at. We'll do another stream for them. We'll do another stream maybe tomorrow, where we'll go over some more interviews. But yeah. To all two of you that have tuned in and stayed watching, have a good one. I'll catch you tomorrow, and see you then.